Today we're going to be looking at another budget card, and that's the RX 550. You'll find a lot of these cards in AliExpress or even in your local used marketplace. Now, if you're a budget gamer, is this card something you should consider? We're going to be running this card on our usual multiplayer shooters. Obviously, this is a low-end card, and it's actually a few years old now, so we wouldn't be expecting too much from this card. However, what we want to see is if this card can actually reach decent 60 FPS on our fast-paced titles. Is it decent enough for the budget gamer? And to make things interesting, on the later part of the video, we're also going to be comparing this card against a lower tier card that's much more modern, like the RX 6500 XT. It'll be interesting to see how big is the gap between these two cards. The good thing about the RX 550 is that it doesn't require a power connector, so you can plug this into any office PC, which you'll probably find in the used marketplace. What we have here is the higher spec 4GB model with 640 stream processors. We're going to be putting this card on our Ryzen 5800 X3D system. This may not be the ideal processor for the budget gamer, however, throughout the games we've tested here, I'm just going to let you know that we are bottlenecked by the RX 550 in all the games. If you guys are new to the channel, we don't do any benchmark chats in here. Instead, I want you guys to focus on the frame times. This is a visual representation of stuttering in game. Ideally, you would want this one to be lower and stable, so any frame time spikes would tell you that there is a bit of a stutter in that moment. We've run all our games on real world low or competitive settings. We also run the games for at least 30 minutes before we started recording our benchmark runs to ensure consistency. Latest drivers and windows were used at the time of testing. Okay, let's start with our first game, Warzone. Let's start off by running native 1080p here, and it's pretty bad. We're not even reaching 30 FPS, and you can see that we are utilizing our system RAM here to compensate for the lower VRAM of the RX 550. Let's try to put on FSR 3, and we're going to be running it on quality settings. Here you go, we've got a few FPS bump here, going beyond the 30 FPS now, and our frame times do tend to be much more stable now. That's roughly 6 milliseconds difference. However, this is still not enough. Let's try to bump it up one more time and set the scaling setting to performance. Here we have FSR 3 performance setting, and looks like it bumped our FPS even more here. We're now reaching 37 FPS. Our frame times continue to drop another 6 milliseconds. Obviously, it's not good enough, but it's better than 38 milliseconds, right? On a real-world Battle Royale game, it will be at around 37 FPS, and as expected, it's not an ideal competitive experience, but it's playable. You will struggle hitting your shots, and you'll struggle with visibility too, but at least you can play, right? That's the main thing. Apex Legends is another one of our fast-paced shooters, and in here we're once again GPU bottleneck by the RX 550 at 100%. Look at that. It's pretty hot too at 73 degrees, and that's a single fan isn't doing much for this guy. We do get to achieve 60 FPS here if there's not much going on. However, once we are engaging other legions and there's some special effects like smokes or we're getting fired at, our FPS will drop to 30s. Once again, this is playable to some degree. We wouldn't be winning any fights here, but hey, at least you can be a strong support to your team. Let's move on to another competitive game. This time it's Fortnite. This game can run 3 APIs, the X11, X12, and performance mode, which is a trimmed down version of the X11 designed for lower end systems. Looking at all 3 APIs here, it's pretty obvious that performance mode is our only option. The FPS is not that high, but at least it's going past 100 FPS sometimes. Running performance mode on a real world game, we can see that our RX 550 is definitely struggling here. And yes, you can reach 100 FPS with lows not far behind here, and you can get some shots here and there. Not great, but hey, you can still enjoy the game. This is actually a much better experience compared to our previous 2 games. And before we proceed, boys, if you like the test that we do here, benchmarking live service shooting games, hit that subscribe button. Okay, let's move on to the next game, Valorant. This is another competitive title which supposedly doesn't require a lot of GPU resource. However, in our game here with competitive settings, we have once again maxed out our GPU. We are getting about 180 FPS here, frame times of about 5 to 6 milliseconds, which is not bad really. You can play this game comfortably, and you can see that here we're able to hit those shots. And there's a lot of effects though. Usually with finishers, our FPS do drop less than 100. I've tested this using minimal settings as well, and you can see that you do get an extra headroom with the RX 550 on minimal settings. You're able to push that FPS even more if you're willing to lose out on a few graphical advantages. I mean, it just depends on what your preference is. Let's move back to our graphically demanding titles. PUBG, and we are using the X11 Enhanced API here, and you can definitely see the struggle that we are going through here. We're once again back to 30 to 40 FPS, and PUBG GPU bottleneck is so hard here that our Ryzen 5800 X3D is just not able to move anywhere. You can clearly see that we are really disadvantaged here. Definitely not the best experience. I think if you want to reach higher FPS here, you might have to drop down your resolution to 720p. But then again, you'd suffer with disabilities. So Helldivers 2 is another DX12 title which is graphically demanding. Here we have the native 1080p at low settings with the RX 550, and look at that, 20 FPS boys. That is so low, bro. Let's compare that with upscaling, and here we have low settings with performance upscaling, and we just doubled our FPS. Obviously, visibility would be an issue in this setting as it becomes too pixelated, but we definitely need to boost that FPS. On a real-world Helldive difficulty scenario with the terminated bugs, the experience is very challenging. You're stuck with 40 FPS, and once again, visibility is a challenge. You probably end up close and personal with this swarm of bugs, and with multiple effects, the FPS would drop even further, as you can see here. Here we have the RX 550 compared against the RX 6500 XT. First up, Warzone, and for consistency, we just left this one at FSR 3 quality settings, and look at that. Look at the humongous difference between the two cards here. The RX 6500 XT has almost 5 times the FPS of the RX 550. Now, if you want to save a bit more, you can definitely game comfortably with the newer card. In Helldivers 2, it's the same thing. The RX 6500 XT, as expected, is still dominating in this list. However, it's not as high as Warzone. The FPS difference is around plus 250% more. In PUBG, we are back again to 3 times the FPS difference between the two cards. The downside of the RX 6500 XT is that it does require a 6-pin power connector, which, as you can see, is using 90 watts here. The RX 550 doesn't have any power rating because it doesn't actually require a power cable. Moving on to our lighter games in Fortnite, we're back again at 3 times the FPS difference. In performance mode, the RX 550 is heavily GPU bottleneck, whereas the RX 6500 XT is at 84% usage, giving our CPU the room to push more frames. In Valorant, the RX 6500 XT pushes through, although not as high as the other games like Warzone. The difference in FPS is still sizable in Valorant, and both our running benchmark and our heavy action scene benchmark, the RX 6500 XT is leading against the RX 550. The RX 550 can be purchased at around $60, while RX 6500 XT is at $130 right now. There is a significant performance difference between the two cards. However, the RX 6500 XT does come with some caveats. It requires a power connector and possibly a PCIe 4.0 system to be fully optimized, as it only has 4 lanes. If you are in a PCIe 3.0 system, you might want to consider going for the mid-range Polaris model, which is the RX 580. Now, we did a video on this card a few months back, and its performance is actually not bad, especially considering the price. If you're interested in that, click this video right here, and we'll see you guys over there.